different monitors right now. Thank you again. This is the first meeting of a brand new pediatric vehicular heat stroke academic stakeholders work group. I want to thank everybody for participating and taking the time to join us today. We did have close to 50 people register for this session. And so I am going to ask everybody to enter their names and your organizations, if you're affiliated with one, in the chat box, just to introduce yourselves to one another, because I'm thrilled to tell you that we have a full agenda. We have several fantastic speakers, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to hear from all of them. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. And again, bear with me. Okay. So today we're going to go over the purpose of this group. As I said, we have several presentations we're going to be hearing. And then as time allows, we're going to talk about next steps for this group. In regards to purpose, some people are aware that NHTSA also leads a collaborative partnerships work group. And so we've been asked, how does this one differ? Well, the NHTSA work group mainly focuses on a collaborative and unified communications plan. They more specifically focus retailers and employers, and they want all the advocates, they bring all the advocates together just to make sure we have unified messaging to raise awareness about this important topic. Whereas this group, we're going to work collaboratively to advance next steps in vehicular heat stroke prevention. Making sure that we're all at the same baseline information. A high level overview is this is the leading cause of non-crash motor vehicle related deaths for children. Almost 900 children have died since 1998. These deaths have occurred in all months of the year in all but 3 US states. And while there's one particular circumstance that we most often hear about, and that's forgetting or unknowingly leaving children in a vehicle, there are actually 3 primary circumstances. There's the forgetting, there's also children gaining access to unlocked vehicles, and then there's children who were knowingly left in vehicles, not because of malintent, which is usually highlighted in the media, but more so because people in general truly don't understand vehicle heating dynamics. And so we want to bring everybody to the table, brainstorm how what can we do differently? You know, traditionally, there's been a lot of focus on education, advocacy, and outreach. We really need to start thinking, what else can we do because we are not at zero? So we're going to look at some evidence-based measures. To get us started today, we're going to be hearing from Ms. Deona Bien, who is a parent advocate. We have Dr. David Diamond with USF, Dr. Castle Williams with NOAA, Laurel Glenn with VTTI, and Carrie Redden with Toxel. I want to thank all of them for their time and participation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dee. Thank you, Dee.
Hi, thank you. Good day. I don't know if it's morning or afternoon, but it's early afternoon here. My name is Deona Bien. I am a nurse. I am a director for Women and Children's Services at Tucson Medical Center in Tucson, Arizona. And I wanted to share with you a little bit of my daughter's story, and I'm really excited to be a part of this group and to be working with you all. Next slide. This is my daughter, Aslan Ryan. A few short days after Aslan's first birthday in 2004, our day was a routine, normal day. That morning, Aslan was toddling through the kitchen, holding a book for her dad to read just before they were set to go to the babysitters. I kissed her on the forehead as I left for work. I'd recently changed jobs and moved to a manager role in Honolulu, Hawaii. So our routine had changed from her being at the sitters from 2 days to 3 days a week to 5 days a week. Just as I was getting ready to leave for work, I received a call from my husband telling me that the sitter had called an ambulance because Aslan was having difficulty breathing. I got in my car and quickly drove across the island. On the journey, my first thoughts were that she might have had an asthma attack or maybe swallowed something that was affecting her airway. But nothing prepared me for the scene that unfolded as I entered the emergency room. As I walked into the trauma bay, I could hear them
Let's just give it a minute. I'm not sure if Dee can hear me. Your screen has frozen. So let's just wait a second. And maybe she had to disconnect and come back. I will tell you, Dee has been gracious enough to present in back-to-back meetings for us. She presented yesterday, and now she's presenting today. And I think what she was about to get to, because hopefully she's going to come back. As a nurse, she knew when she walked into the emergency room that the situation was not good. Let me just check. I want to give her a chance to finish sharing her experience. As you can see on the slide that we have up right now, she said most parents never recover, some choose to advocate, and that is something that she has actively done. Thank you, Amber. I do see your chat. Amber texted her and she is coming back on. I want to thank everyone for your patience. I think in thinking about reframing how we present this issue, a lot of times we just hear, again, especially in the media, that parents forget their children in the vehicle. And in this case, Aslan wasn't with her parents. So it truly, we've emphasized before from the National Safety Council and, you know, other advocates, anyone that's transporting children should be educated on this topic and why children are more at risk. And this is a perfect example of why. Something we can do, if Dr. Diamond is okay with it, we could advance to Dr. Diamond's presentation, and then we could come back to Dee's presentation when she's back on the line with us.
My apologies. I just got booted back on a couple of times.
It's okay. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm not sure where it ended at, but I'll go ahead and start with this screen. My daughter's first birthday was shortly after, or was right before this incident occurred. And so in 2004, our day was normal. She was preparing to go to the babysitter for the day. So she was carrying a book, wanting her dad to read to her before we left. My job had changed to where I was working 2 to 3 days a week to 5 days a week. Just as I was getting ready to leave work for the day, I received a call from my husband telling me that the sitter had called an ambulance because Aslan was having difficulty breathing. I quickly drove across the island to Kapiolani Women and Children's Hospital. Nothing prepared me for what I was walking into. As I walked into the trauma bay, my daughter was being intubated and she was having a temperature called out of 106. Her blood sugar was 20. And all the vitals and labs that they were calling out made me realize as a nurse that this was something that was very severe. They quickly stabilized her and moved her to the pediatric intensive care. She was inadvertently left in a hot car for approximately 50 minutes. Next slide. 2 days after her being inadvertently left in a hot car, Aslan succumbed to global brain damage from anoxia related to the incident of being left in a hot car. The events of the tragedy were a result of Aslan's sitter having a new routine. She'd also been in a backup car that she was not used to driving in. Her car seat was positioned rear facing directly behind the driver, taking her out of the line of sight. She was also quiet at the time, and this increased her potential to be easily forgotten. At that time, there was no alert or reminder, but I feel that if a simple alert and reminder were in place, that it could have saved our family a lifetime of heartache. As the waves of emotion started to filter down from the very beginning, my choice was very clear. How could I, as a mother, let the world pass by and grieve? I should have to advocate for my child and other children who have gone before her. After the incident, we moved to Tucson, Arizona shortly after her death so that I could be closer to family. And I began working with an incredible community hospital. They helped me to find my advocacy legs and helped me to do what needed to be done to help save other children. They connected me with community partners because education is where all of the experts felt it was needed. They also connected me with national partners and legislation because we felt compelled that legislation was needed. Legislation is still needed for alerts and reminders to be in cars and to protect children. Next slide. In 2007, my journey of advocacy led me back to Hawaii. I met with Governor Linda Lingle, her staff, Representative Lee, and testified on behalf of legislation for the state, and was honored to be present for the signing of the law in 2008. The great thing about this law is that it had an educational component. It had a test on the driver's exam that was required, and the state had a requirement for all rental car agencies to educate consumers when they rented a car on the law. I've also worked with other states such as Arizona and South Carolina, but most often our legislation efforts went without any success. Many people believe that it was a situation of bad parenting. After all, who could forget their child, not a loving parent? Truth be told, none of our memories are perfect, and there are no socioeconomical boundaries. This can happen to anyone. It happened to me, my family, doctors, lawyers, healthcare workers, cooks, you name it. In some states where laws were not in place, some cities enacted ordinances, but that was not enough. Parents created ways of workarounds so that they could protect their children by adding aftermarket products, apps with alerts, reminders, even doing old school tricks such as the shoe trick of leaving your shoe or something you need in the back seat of a car. Next slide. We as parents are working very hard to create more traction around the Hot Cars Act. We long to create a safety mechanism for parents and caregivers. It's been 17 years since my daughter passed away, and we've brought forward more education, more information, and educated more than ever. However, the death toll of children every year continues to rise. Sadly, more and more families have joined this club of parents that none of us ever really wanted to be a part of. And every year when an incident occurs, people like Jeanette Fennell and Amber Rollins connect all of us so that we can be a support system for other parents who've suffered this tragedy. We share our stories far and wide. We hope for the day that this type of death will long be a forgotten incident. In sharing our children's stories, we never know the faces or the names of the families or the children whose lives we've impacted. And I'm certain that children have been saved from us sharing our stories. Our most current mission is the Hot Cars Act to ensure that alerts and reminders are a standard in all cars and that no other family suffers the way that we do every day without our children. We take a small fraction of the time that we would have spent raising our children to fight for others. We can't stop, we won't stop until we are at zero. And we do this with every fiber of our being to honor our children. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you, Dee. I can't even begin to imagine how much courage it takes to share your experience with everyone. And, you know, you and I have talked a little bit. We're here so that other people don't have to join that club that you're referencing. So I just want to thank you again for your bravery and for sharing your experience with all of us. And that is why we're here, to try and get this number to zero. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, I want to introduce you to David Diamond, Dr. David Diamond with the University of South Florida.
Well, thank you for organizing this group, Amy, and thank you for inviting me to present some of my research on this topic today. So I've been studying the brain and memory for over 40 years, and I've specifically studied children forgotten in cars for about the last 15 years. I've interviewed dozens of parents and caretakers who have forgotten children in cars, and I've heard so many of the heartbreaking stories, such as the one we heard from Deona. So what I'm going to do is just summarize a bit about how I've applied the capacity for someone to be able to forget a child in a car to what we know about the brain and memory. A couple of years ago, I published a paper on this on a medical legal journal to describe exactly how it is that the circumstances and brain structures involved, and how it's possible for a loving and attentive person, whether parent or caretaker, to forget a child in a car. And so just start briefly with just some of the major players in the brain, each one having a different function. So on the left, you have the prefrontal cortex, and that's what you use to strategize. You're saying to yourself, along my drive today, I want to stop at daycare and bring my child. Along the bottom, the hippocampus, the structure in blue, that keeps track of all the details of our lives. Everything that's happening is processed by the hippocampus. So our memory of the child in the car is maintained by the hippocampus. The basal ganglia, which is often seen as the sort of the evil part of this. This is the one that causes actually people to forget, but it's quite convenient. The basal ganglia allows us to do lots of things without thinking about it. So when you've driven somewhere many times, the basal ganglia takes over, and you can do it by habit. Unfortunately, the basal ganglia can suppress our hippocampus, and we lose awareness of the plan. We lose awareness that our child is in the car. So the next slide. And I just want to cover a couple types of memory, because people say, how is it possible you can forget your child? You look at a picture of your child, of course, you know your child's name, you know you have a child. How can you forget that? And it's not that you forget that you have a child. And this is what confuses people. So I've broken this down into two kinds of memory. There's factual information, and that's the hippocampus's job, to remember what you had for breakfast, the name of your child, the name of your daycare. That's the job of the hippocampus. There's something called prospective memory, in which you are planning to do something in the future. For example, you have an appointment later today. You need to remember to go to your appointment. You want to call someone later today. You want to remember that. In the lower right, I have a picture that if I want to stop at the store, and frankly, I know that I'll forget along the way, so I put a little stick-it note on my steering wheel, pick up milk at the store, because I know that that is the most vulnerable kind of memory. When you're planning to do something in the future, you have to remember at just the right time. That's prospective memory. And if you're planning on stopping in the store, you would very likely just to drive right by as you're lost in your thoughts. That's how we lose information. That's prospective memory. And that's the critical one. That's in which we lose awareness and forget about taking the child to daycare. So on the next slide. And it's prospective memory that leads to different kinds of catastrophic failures of memory. And so people say, well, how can you forget a child in a car? In my research, what I have found is different kinds of catastrophes that occur with a failure of prospective memory. This one, some people don't like that I talk about someone in a bathroom, but this is extraordinary. The picture on the left is actually with a detective who was in Tampa at the movie theater and had a gun with him as he was using the toilet. And he put his gun on the toilet roll dispenser. As he was finishing using the toilet, his son came in and said, hurry, Dad, the movie's about to start. In that moment, he turned from the gun, finished what he was doing, ran out to be able to go see the movie with his son, completely losing awareness that he had a loaded gun that he had left in this public bathroom. Fortunately, there was no catastrophe, but it could have been. The middle picture shows that pilots were going through their typical preparation to take off. But right at the moment, we know this from the black box audio, just as they were getting to set the flaps properly, they were distracted. And in that moment, went on to the next component of their preparation and never set the flaps properly. This plane went up a few hundred feet and then crashed straight down. Almost everyone died. And of course, we've got on the side, people lose awareness of a child in the car, and they lose awareness not only of the child, but of the plan to take the child to daycare. Next slide. So I happen to see someone, just to show you this happens all the time. this failure of prospective memory. I was actually sitting at a window at a coffee shop. I saw a woman leave the coffee shop and set her a cup of soda on the roof. And in a moment, I saw her as she was reaching for her keys, she was distracted. Something happened in the street. She looked to her right. And right at that moment, after she had set the cup on the roof, she got back, turned back to the car, opened the door, went through her habit, got into the car, and the next slide, and off she went. And she went driving away. And so this is the kind of thing, a failure of prospective memory, which can lead to catastrophes, or it could be relatively benign. And what's fascinating also about memory is that when that cup spills over onto her windshield, she's going to have that memory booted. It says the hippocampus is holding on to that information, but it has been suppressed by this temporary control of the basal ganglia of having you do something automatically. And so you will remember, I left the cup on my roof. So that memory is not destroyed. It's just been suppressed by that habit that you have. You normally just go into the car and drive away. Now, sometimes people do get a bit offended. They say, well, how can you compare remembering a child in a car to a cup on the roof? And I use this only as an example to illustrate how powerful it is that our habit system is and how weak our prospective memory is. The same functioning goes on whether it's a cup on the roof or remembering your child in a car. It's the same interaction of brain structures. So on the next slide. And again, I talked about the plane crash, and the cup on the roof is really the same as failing to set the flaps properly. When we get distracted, we lose awareness of our plan. Temporarily, hippocampus gets suppressed, basal ganglia takes over, we do something out of habit, and that can be catastrophic. And that's what happened with this plane crash in which almost all people died. So what we've got now is technology. Airline pilots must literally go through a checklist. They must check it off as they're preparing to take off. And if the flaps are not set properly, and this is very important, there is technology that sounds an alarm in the cockpit to say flaps are not set properly. So we use technology now to make sure that this kind of crash doesn't happen again. The next slide. And so again, here is actually the article about it. And I've talked to Detective Hussey about this part of my research. And he just explained how he just forgot this and left. To understand, cup on the roof, flaps not set properly, leaving a gun in a bathroom. And frankly, there are numerous times, I've seen dozens of articles in the news about police officers, detectives, security guards who leave their guns in public bathrooms. This is all because you get into a habit which doesn't normally include grabbing your gun. That habit overrides your conscious awareness that you just set your gun somewhere. And so next slide. And, you know, we don't keep track exactly how many pets, how many animals die in hot cars, but it's really the same phenomenon. What we have so often are police officers who have their dogs in the back. The officers are driving, they lose awareness of a sleeping dog in the car. In this case, in about a 5-week period, 4 police dogs died as a result, as it says, mistakenly leaving a dog in the car. And so we see different ways in which memory fails and results in catastrophes. And it's all a failure of prospective memory. You get in the car, you have the plan to remove the dog from the car. And that plan, now you lose awareness of it. And so in the next slide, it brings us to the primary topic we're here today. So with all that I've covered, you can understand now, when you see the woman driving here and you've got a child in the back, out of view, perhaps a sleeping child, a quiet child, and the person now drives and the basal ganglia, your habit system takes over. You lose awareness of the child in the car. You get to your destination. Because you've lost awareness, you go through your habit. You exit the car and you go on with whatever you were doing. What's critical is, yes, it is a form of forgetting. And the way to think about it is a loss of awareness following going through some kind of routine. The next slide, please. And I like to visualize this for people. I think it's kind of helpful that if you think about a standard habit, a routine, you're going from home, typically, let's say you're driving to work, and visually think about going along on a train track. And you've done this hundreds, maybe thousands of times. And you typically let's say, don't take the child to daycare. Your spouse takes the child to daycare. So in the next slide, I want to visualize how now we're changing the plan. And then next slide. Amy. So what you've got here is the way your brain is processing. When you leave home, you are fully aware that you've got your child. This is now in this kind of brownish look. And so you're aware you've got your home plus your child. You're suppressing, as you get into the car, the normal path, which takes you from home straight to work. You have the plan to stop along the way. And this is the pattern. This is in which people are looking to stop along the way, go to daycare, and then get back on your typical route, and then go to work. So there is typically some variant of this in which you have to change your habit, change your routine, bring the child somewhere, and then get back into your routine. That is the plan. And the next slide. What happens during the drive is the plan is lost. You lose awareness of the plan. The routine now takes over. And so your brain has switched to that plan, which is, oh, we're driving to work as we normally do. And so each case is some variant of this in which the habit routine takes over, basal ganglia takes over, hippocampus is suppressed. And so instead of having that memory right available to you, you go straight from home to work, or there's some variant of this. The next slide. Now, the question is, how often does this happen? And there was a frightening survey with results in which, and this was reported at the National Lifesavers Conference some years ago, that when asked about forgetting their children in cars, about 25% of parents with children under 3 had reported at some point they had forgotten their child was in the car. And that's extraordinary, but it's consistent sort of with the idea that as you're in a routine and your child is quiet behind you, out of your view, at some point you lose awareness. And obviously, and fortunately, 25% of children are not forgotten. In fact, it's extremely rare that a child is actually forgotten in a car and the child suffers from organ damage or dies. So why is it that it is fortunately extremely rare that children actually die as a result of being forgotten in cars? So I address that in the next slide. So we can think of this in terms of there is potential tragedy, which is on the right, the loss of awareness of the child. And we have barriers that can protect us, that interfere with ultimately the child dying. And so we have multiple barriers, and you can think about it, it's like Swiss cheese, each with a hole. And in order for tragedy to occur, you have to have all these slices lined up so everything goes wrong. Every barrier is penetrated. So the first is, this is simply a part of being a parent, a caretaker. You've got sleep deprivation, the chronic stress, and often there is stress during the drive. And that increases the likelihood that the driver will lose awareness of the child. The second one is, and it is so consistent, the child is quiet. And so when the child is quiet, we even had cases in which there are multiple people in the car and everyone loses awareness of the child because they're not looking at the child and the child is quiet. So there is no cue to tell the people that the child is in the car. And obviously you don't have a crying or talking child. So that is clearly another barrier in which you can hear or see the child. You clearly have this habit memory. That is another factor. If there is this habit memory, it can control the way you're processing information. And finally, there are many people who have contacted me who have said, they forgot their child in a car, and they just feel so fortunate that the car was in a cool place. Okay? It was not hot outside. The car was not out in the sun. The car may have been in a parking structure. So that final barrier is, what's the temperature outside? How long is the car being left outside? When everything lines up and everything goes wrong, that is that extremely rare circumstance in which the child is now exposed to intolerable heat and suffers brain damage or heat stroke. That helps us to understand why it is so extremely rare, because essentially everything has to go wrong for this to happen. Next slide. And everyone I'm sure is already aware, I didn't want to elaborate on it. We're aware of the Hot Cars Act, the need for an automated system, for technology to stop this right at that second barrier. We need to have a cue that tells us when all the other barriers have failed. We must have a cue that when we arrive at our destination reminds us that the child is in the car. And the very same reason that we have a reminder, we have technology telling us we've left our headlights on because we don't want a dead battery. We must have the technology that tells us that there is a child in the car. This is absolutely the ideal way in which we can have no longer have children being forgotten in cars. Next slide. So there is a strategy, which I've heard of, and I guess there are different variants on it. Look before you lock. And also, I guess another variant is park, look, and lock. And as a scientist, and I've interviewed so many parents, and I understand when does this actually happen, I want to suggest that that's not a good strategy, despite the fact that it sounds intuitive. Obviously, if you just look in the back, you'll see the child. It makes sense, but in the real world, I don't think it works. And so the first scenario, and this is so common, what you have is a parent that always drives straight to work and does not have the child. The other parent typically takes the child to daycare. Well, if you say to that child, well, you should always park, look, and lock, or look before you lock, the parent that never has the child is, why would I do that? I know my child's not in my car. And so that person is not developing the habit of look before you lock, park, look, and lock. There's no reason to look in the back seat because you know your child's not there. So you're never going to develop that habit because it doesn't make sense to you. And I've had people in which there are certain days in which they know they have the child, let's say Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, they're taking the child to daycare, and their spouse takes a child on Thursday and Friday. Well, if you ask that parent on Monday, say, well, should you park, look, and lock, or should you look before you? Well, of course not. That will be their response. Because I know my child is in there. But if it happens to be a Thursday, a day in which you normally drive straight to work, that's a day in which you haven't developed a habit to look before you lock, park, look, and lock. So you're not going to do it, especially if you're sleep deprived and you're stressed. What we need, absolutely, and this is in the absence of technology, is you must have a reminder that on this drive today, your child is in the car. In the same way, it's only when I need to stop at the store that I put a reminder on my steering wheel that says, today, pick up milk at the store. That's what's crucial. So any aspect of technology or any reminder has to tell you that this is a unique drive. In this drive, your child is in the store, is in the car. So if we go to the next slide, it would be my suggestion. What I would suggest is make it a habit, okay? Move it so you'll see it. Put something in the car seat. As you see here, there's a stuffed animal in the car seat. And this isn't a toy for the child. This is something that says the car seat is unoccupied. When you put the child in the car seat, take that stuffed animal and put it right in front of you. And I've now taken that stuffed animal, I put it right here at the drive shaft, and I even wrote a note, remember the baby. And it's there during your drive. It's there when you shut the car off. And so the simple message would be for those people who accept that they could forget their child in the car. I know I've heard about put your cell phone in the back, put your shoe in the back. This to me is the simplest way to respond to the problem, to deal with the problem. Move it so you'll see it. And with a little note on it that says, remember the baby. And I think in the absence of technology, I would say this would work pretty well. I thank you again for allowing me to have some time to share with you my thoughts on this, as well as some of the science. So thank you again, Amy. That's the last slide.
Thank you, Dr. Diamond. We really appreciate your time. And, you know, I think all of us that have been working in this arena have heard time and time again about being on autopilot. So this really helps to go through the steps. Thank you again.
You're welcome.
Next, we're going to keep moving through with our presenters. And then I just put in the chat box, please enter your questions for the speakers there. And as time allows at the end, we will address Q&A. If we don't get to it today, this is intended to be a series of meetings, and we will revisit questions in future meetings. So with that, I want to introduce you to Dr. Castle Williams.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Amy, for inviting me and having me present some of my research. So kind of similar to Dr. Diamond, but I'm thinking more of it in terms of a risk communication approach. I'm currently a social scientist that's being contracted to NOAA, and this was some of my thesis work when I was a master's student 5 or 6 years ago. But it creates an interesting kind of combination of risk communication, hot temperatures, but also public health. So as both a meteorologist and a risk communication expert, this is kind of a problem that intersects all of those different avenues. Next slide, please. So I won't go much into the background. I feel like everyone on this call pretty much has it down pat. I think the interesting thing that I will note, the reason why we kind of thought to take this risk communication approach is that a lot of the current research in the literature is rather physical science based. So for example, my advisor, Dr. Andrew Grenstein, who I did this work with, has done a lot of work on how quickly cars heat up, the different types of cars, and how that changes how quickly they heat up, and that kind of avenue, those different types of physical science questions. But there wasn't a lot about how parents are interpreting this risk. Do they feel as though they are at risk? And if not, why? What types of behaviors are they doing? Those types of questions, I feel like were kind of left out a bit. So that was really the motivation for this research. If you'll go to the next slide. We really wanted to kind of address this gap and start thinking more about our public health messaging. And so that's where my interest comes, really, is thinking about the message and how we can think, how can we better understand risk perceptions and behaviors of both parents and caregivers. So to do this, we kind of approached it from a risk and health communication perspective. And if anyone isn't familiar with those types of theories, I'll provide a little bit more information in the next coming slides. But again, we're really interested more in, are parents and caregivers familiar with this issue? Do they feel like it could happen to them? Do they think that they could forget their own child in a vehicle? But also more specifically looking at some of the hot car messaging that already existed. Keep in mind, I conducted these interviews about 5 or 6 years ago, so it may be a little bit outdated at this point. But thinking about what types of hot car messaging have you heard, and also thinking about some of the initiatives that were going on in Georgia when we started these interviews. So next slide, please. So you can go ahead in the next slide too. So again, we took a nice health and risk communication approach. So I'm not familiar if anyone's familiar with the mental model approach, but it's a risk communication approach that really wants people to consider their mental model, and for us kind of as social scientists to go in and kind of understand what their mental model is, so that we can kind of portray it in a different way. And the best way that I like to explain a mental model is we all kind of have our own mental model of what it's like to go into a grocery store. For example, we know that the fruits and the meats, and also kind of the frozen section, is always going to be kind of on that outside ring of the grocery store. No matter which one you go into, it's kind of the way that they are laid out. And that kind of really transitions nicely to a mental model. It's really about a person's knowledge, perceptions, beliefs, and other information that an individual uses to reach some sort of conclusion. So we all have mental models about various things. For example, when you order something at a restaurant, these are all things that we kind of have a simple mental model about. And so the reason that why we kind of approached it from this mental model approach is that it's really interesting to do this exercise with both experts and members of the public. Because when we do this, we get to kind of understand what knowledge the experts are wanting to share with their audience, but we also get to understand what type of information the public currently knows and maybe what's lacking. So by comparing these two different mental models, we can really understand how we can better tailor some of our messaging to meet some of the needs or areas that we see may be lacking in members of the public. So next slide, please. So when doing so, we did interviews with a lot of experts, and actually a lot of you on the call. I don't know if you remember me talking to you 5 or 6 years ago, but you were very helpful in helping me think about the problem and also think about how are experts kind of approaching or tackling this problem. And if you'll hit the next button, So you can see there a lot of you I spoke with, a lot of you on the call, like Jan Knoll I saw was on the call, and also I talked to Dr. Diamond and a lot of different individuals in order to really help us understand how are the experts in this field thinking about this and also kind of approaching it from a messaging standpoint. But then if you'll hit the next slide, what we also did was we talked with parents and caregivers in our local community. And so we did this by recruiting them through local daycare agencies, and we made sure to kind of diversify our sample by going to different socioeconomic areas and different daycares in order to make sure that we had some sort of a diverse sample. Of course, because it is an interview methodology, we don't have kind of the generalizability that we're going to get with a larger representative survey. But mental model approaches are more about kind of understanding kind of the qualitative themes that are going on and to really dig deep into some of the really nice material. So if you'll hit next. So some of the results. So this is a mental model of the experts. And I'll kind of explain it a little bit, and then you can kind of explore a little bit on with your eyes. So when I was talking to the experts, there were kind of 6 big areas that stuck out, or 5 big areas with the experts really. Current messaging and the ways that we do things. So that's in the top left corner. Different laws and policies, which is kind of in the middle on the left. And the bottom left is psychological and physiological factors. So for example, a lot of the stuff that Dr. Diamond just talked about, including autopilot, stress, memory systems, etc. In the top right was technology. So thinking about what types of technology already exist out there, others that need to be built into vehicles, etc. Thinking about the car environment. So we talked about visual cues, sleeping children, being quiet, as Dr. Diamond just mentioned. So that came out a lot in those expert interviews. And also these lifestyle factors. And so you can see in this expert one, a lot of these boxes are kind of grayed out, but with red. These are things that showed up in the parent interviews that did not show up in the expert interviews. So you can see that the things that did show up in the expert interviews were these white boxes, such as being bad parents or intentionally leaving children. And the reason in the context of this, the experts talked about these as things that they've heard from parents. So again, these are kind of perceptions that are coming up, but these were 6 large themes that arose during the expert interviews. And so what we wanted to do is kind of try and map these across both the experts and the parents to figure out how does some of the knowledge compare across these experts and parents. So you can see that built into vehicles stands out a lot. This was discussed by almost every expert in depth about, again, very similar to the Hot Cars Act, about how we need to build in this technology into our vehicles to make sure that there is not a need for this willingness to purchase some of these outside devices or smartphone apps. You can also see that parents talked about how if we do need to have some sort of smartphone app or these outside technologies, we need to make sure that they're cost efficient, potentially built into car seats, etc. In terms of messaging, we had a lot of experts talk about the advantages of public health campaigns and getting those messages out there. So those were really important, as well as news reports. Experts didn't mention it quite as often as parents did, which I'll discuss in a minute, but that information did come up. And then lastly, some of the other big things was, again, that psychological and physiological factors. As Dr. Diamond mentioned, these are a lot of different aspects of the problem that experts are really honed in on and they're really locked in on. These are some of the areas that deserve more attention. And so that, of course, was talked about a little bit more among the experts. So next slide, please. So if we look at this in comparison to the mental model that parents and caregivers gave us, very similar layout. Everything is identical, except some of the arrows and their thicknesses have changed. And that's because that is where some of the parents talked about things a bit more. And you'll see the arrows that are red are things that stand out as being different from the expert mental model. So things in particular that are really standing out, In the top left in the messaging area are those news reports. Almost every parent that I spoke with mentioned that they have learned about this issue through news reports alone. Only one person indicated that they had learned about this issue through a public health campaign, which was one of the big major takeaways from my study, was that we think as experts we're getting our messaging out there through some of these public health campaigns and through some of this messaging. But it turns out that parents, for the most part, are learning a lot about this information and the dangers of it through news reports. So I think it's important that we kind of think about some of these health partnerships with news organizations to provide them with better press kits and media kits, et cetera, to think about how to provide some of the messaging that we as experts want to get across, to make sure that's consistent with some of the things that come across in those news reports. And then also, because this was back in 2015, the Cobb County case was very big. I did this study in Georgia, so of course that's going to come out as being very relevant. Similar to the experts, a lot of parents did talk about this would happen when there was a change in routine, when things are on autopilot, things are stressful, etc. For obvious reasons, they didn't bring up memory systems, which I think makes a lot of sense. But I think one of the big areas that did stick out again are those lifestyle factors. When it comes to parents and caregivers, I have some stats a little bit later in my presentation, but more than 50% said that they would never, they could never imagine forgetting their child in a hot car. And I think that's kind of a very relevant reaction given some of the information we've already heard on this call today. But instead of kind of understanding that it was in the realm of possibility for them, they usually attributed it to other lifestyle factors as kind of this othering practice of, well, it's not me that could be impacted, but it's someone else. And for that reason, they provided information on, well, it's probably single parents, parents that are working parents, parents that are busy or rushed. A lot of people use the term bad parents, and they included those that were unfit or maybe were abusive of drugs and alcohol. They tried to think about and kind of other this problem or this issue to some of those lifestyle factors. So you can see that there's a lot of red arrows in that lifestyle factors area. And then lastly, which I think is important, is this idea of technology. A lot of parents were not open to the idea of purchasing additional devices, smartphone apps, etc. They wanted things that were already built into some of the items that they were already purchasing. So I think this kind of bodes nicely for some of this idea of being built into vehicles in the Hot Cars Act. If they're wanting technology that's already built into some of the other devices that they're already purchasing, I think that goes nicely with that. But parents brought up the idea a lot about wanting this type of technology built into car seats that they're already buying and purchasing. And they did indicate that they would be willing to pay more money in order to have these technologies already built into those devices. When they did bring up that they wanted smartphone apps, they said that they needed to have two qualities. They needed to be easy to operate, and they needed to be very cost efficient. They were very particular about those two things when it comes to smartphone apps. So those are some of the major takeaways that are different between the expert and parents' mental models. So if you'll hit the next slide, I can talk about a little bit more of some of our findings. So kind of similar to what I just told you, many of the participants were familiar with this topic, but a lot of them expressed that they could not imagine a situation where they would forget their child, or insisted that a majority of the cases were normally with parents that either intentionally left their child in a vehicle or were associated with parents that were what they called bad parents. So as you can see, there was a significant proportion of denial that people were kind of attributing to this issue. But I will say that there were some parents that were very honest with me and kind of told me that they had done this accidentally before in the past, and kind of similar to Dr. Diamond's statistic that they were just kind of very lucky that it was in a garage or it was during the winter. It wasn't during a time that was very high, that had high temperatures. About half of the participants acknowledged that they had previously heard of an injury prevention technique, and thus were kind of up on what they should do, kind of very similar to some of the things we've heard already on this call of leaving a shoe in the back seat or leaving your purse or a computer bag back there. And then this last statistic is very similar to some of those technological interventions I was talking about. Over 75% had not heard of such a thing, but they would be, again, incentivized if they were at reduced cost or possessed passive qualities, such as being built into other types of technology or devices. Next slide, please. In terms of current messaging, I think I kind of hit a lot of the high notes on this. But one thing in particular I'll kind of mention is some of our partners within the state of Georgia we spoke with, and they were curious about their Look Again campaign that they had started. And so we intentionally asked parents and caregivers about this, and only 3 parents or caregivers had heard of the Look Again campaign, and none of them really provided any specific details about the material. So again, not a lot of information coming from those public health campaigns. And again, the news and incident reports being kind of that high place of information. Next slide. Can this happen to me? And maybe hit it one more time so the bottom might show up. There you go. Can it happen to me? This was kind of one of those indicators we were trying to figure out how people felt about their risk perception, about this happening to them. So if you look at a lot of health and risk communication theories, you need both perceived likelihood, which is, again, this can it happen to me, and perceived severity to both be high in order for people to take some sort of behavior change or behavioral action. And you can see here that the perceived susceptibility is very low in this instance, whereas the severity of the incident is very high. So that's one of the other major takeaways from my study, is that in order for us to think about promoting behavioral changes or injury prevention techniques, it's going to be very important for us to increase this perceived susceptibility among this issue. Next slide, please. And then lastly, I'll just kind of highlight some of the applications that I see for future messaging. I already kind of talked about this a little bit, but we need to emphasize that every parent and caregiver is equally susceptible to forgetting their child in a hot car. And one of the examples I provided in the paper that we wrote about this was the major message that a lot of experts were trying to convey was this can happen to everyone. And instead of doing that, I kind of repositioned that message and thought about it would be best if we could convey it as this can happen to you. So that everyone still leaves some room open for the othering effect of, well, everyone may not include me. So by changing that simple thing to this could happen to you, it could provide a little bit more personalization of that message. And lastly, kind of identifying some of these misconceptions that involving unfit parents and lifestyle factors, and making sure that we're really trying to emphasize that that is not the case, and this again can happen to everyone. So making sure to really focus in on those misconceptions. And then lastly, there are some of these just-in-time messages that I think could be really powerful. So for example, when there are extreme temperatures in the forecast, we could start using social media and different ways of getting the message out there so that it's more relevant in the now versus kind of sending out that message just randomly during the summer. So next slide. Just briefly, I'll say next steps. We see really a lot of value in kind of establishing a baseline survey so that we can kind of over time start to chart how risk perceptions may be changing. And we see this as a way to evaluate and create benchmarks for evaluating the success of various initiatives and messaging campaigns and public health campaigns. But without a baseline, it's hard to really create that benchmark. So that's kind of our next step. So if this sounds interesting at all, we're trying to get together a bunch of different survey questions that we can start kind of deploying across the US to get, again, that larger sample to be more representative and generalizable. And we started piloting some survey questions in this past September because we were interested about the implications of COVID on this public health issue. So if there are any interested individuals, please feel free to get in contact with me. And I have my email at the end, so if you'll hit next. And this, just quickly, if you're interested in our article, we do have it published and it's available online. And I think Kids in Cars, thank you very much for putting it on your website so it's easily acceptable to all practitioners. So that's great. Next slide. And go ahead and hit one more. So yeah, so that's my email address, and also Dr. Andrew Grenstein. If you have any questions, or if you're again interested or have survey items that you think would be really valuable on the longitudinal survey, please feel free to let me know. And most definitely I can do that, Joseph. And that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I know I completely agree. Relevancy for parents is a huge barrier in all of the prevention efforts that we have. And so we're really hoping that this group can explore that topic more in future meetings. Next, I do want to introduce you to Laurel Glenn with Virginia Tech. And Laurel, we are running short on time, and the intent was always that our last two presenters were going to give a high level overview of their projects, and then we're going to delve deeper into those in a future meeting. So okay. Laurel, I'll have you talk about yours, and I would just want to thank Carrie Redden because she has already graciously agreed to wait until the next meeting. So with that, go ahead, Laurel.
Okay, I will keep this very high level. So just real quick on why it was important for us. Eric is my husband, and we were in 2017 pregnant with that little one right there. And, you know, as we've heard, parents aren't, you know, things will happen to you. I was very much with the feeling of this could happen to me. The Hot Cars Act was being talked about, and I'm sitting here as a common citizen thinking, well, what can I do, you know, to help push this through? And then all of a sudden we realized we work at a transportation institute, so we could do more than just sign petitions. And so we started getting into this type of research. So that's where we are. So we've done two papers so far. I'm going to talk about the second one here that we just got out, had come out. You can go ahead and next slide. So again, a lot of this we've discussed already. There's the increase of PVH deaths and most likely injuries as well. And a lot of the government and private industries are beginning to support this idea of how we're going to come across and work together in making that number go down to 0. So what we decided to do was wanted to look at this from a behavioral perspective and at the technology that does exist currently. And as more technology becomes through development on what we can do to help. So we first did a lit review on all the technologies that we could find that were out there and available, both the original ones in cars, OEMs, and also the aftermarket devices. And then this last research project we did was to evaluate those products that we could get our hands on and see how they were stacking up behaviorally. And I'll explain what I mean by that in the next slide. Go ahead. So these are the technologies that we did get our hands on for the OEMs, and also the aftermarket you can see listed there. They all fell into 5 categories of technologies. There's 4 there, but there was actually a little bit, we broke it down a little bit more. So there's pressure-based, which again, I'm going to assume that we are familiar with what these are. The trial restraint-based, the ones that are originally on the vehicle, so integrated within the vehicle, both on purchase, and there is also an aftermarket one you can put in your vehicle that's vehicle-based. And there's also just a sensor-based option where you're relying on, for example, you can see the last one listed there under the aftermarket technology is the LFO clip, which is just a clip that you have somewhere in, that on something you would take with you always. And then if your cell phone is too far away from that sensor, it will send an alert. So it's just based on 2 sensors basically and distance. So those were all the technologies that we have gone through for this project. You can go ahead. So what we did here is develop a bunch of different scenarios. So I read through the news articles and any information I could get, stories that were told by parent advocates who this had happened to, and tried to kind of figure out what were the behaviors that people were going through that led to this result, whether it was a child who was knowingly left, unknowingly left, or a child who had gained access to a vehicle and had PVH. So we came up with 24 different scenarios to run through with all these technologies. I'm going to quickly just go over what one would look like. Sorry, these were highlighted, so I'm just going to have to try and guide you through that. If you see under table 3, the second block. So this one would be, for example, driving to a destination, driving to a destination with a mid-trip stop, during which the engine remains on and the rear door opens. These are the situations where, for example, there's a parent who has a child maybe in a car seat in the back and also another child in the car. And maybe they drive and drop off the one child and the rear door opens and they're just stopped, the engine stays on, and they've stopped and let that one child out or gotten them to their destination. And then they drive, perhaps forgetting to stop at a daycare or wherever the second child needed to go, and go into their final destination. So again, get this scenario based on what's happening with these PVH deaths. And then upon arrival, are they going to put it in accessory mode or turn the vehicle off? Oh, one thing to keep in mind, the child left knowingly and unknowingly scenarios are identical. So that can explain why we have the accessory mode on and off. If you consider, for example, caregivers maybe leaving maybe the air on for them or the radio on or something like that. And then locking the doors upon leaving or leaving them unlocked. So that's how one of the scenarios is done. Again, there were 24 of them. And we have the same thing with child having gained access, which you can see in the top right, but I will just continue on. Go ahead. So we ran all the technologies through all of the scenarios that we had developed and rated them based on a couple of items. One was what their ability was to address those PVH death scenarios, which we had outlaid before, as you can see in the last slide. So how able were they to get an alert to someone at the end of those steps, for example, because a lot of these technologies are based on, it could be doors opening, it could be the length of the door opening, it could be the presence of an actual, child there or something rather pressing on the weight or anything like that. So how are these technologies stacking up to actually delivering an alert at the very end of these scenarios? The ease of use of them for the user, and also the ability to gain attention, not only of the caregiver, whoever is responsible at that moment in time in the car, the driver or whoever it might be, and also getting maybe the attention of somebody else. If that wasn't working, could they then get the attention of a bystander or an emergency contact or emergency personnel in general, just to know that there is someone who has addressed the issue at hand. And then of course, the lack of any other conflict with any type of other vehicle system, should it be integrated into the vehicle, making sure that that alert comes off loud and strong and is not interrupted by any other type of alert system that's in the car. Because we all know we get a lot of alerts in our vehicles. Go ahead. All right, so at the end, we rated all of these technologies and we have a large list of suggestions. I only have some listed here due to time. The first one would be that it should be enabled on delivery to the customer, which is what has been discussed in the previous previous speakers. So they should be integrated. However, not all of the vehicles that are on the road today are going to be all of a sudden magically off as soon as all of the OEMs have this system in place within a vehicle. So we have to also consider what kind of aftermarket devices could be used for those vehicles that would not already have them in there. But ideally, for the future, they should all be in the vehicles. Secondly, these should be activated under absolutely normal behavior of putting a child in the car, not asking any other type of need or behavior from the driver. It should be something that's just on and that will activate under the circumstances that there would be a child in the back. One of the problems is that, of course, and that was spoken about in another of the previous talk as well, is that we need to minimize those nuisance alerts. Those alerts that are coming through suggesting that there is the need to pay attention to something in the back when there actually is no child in the back or nothing. It was perhaps just a bag or a bee or who knows what it was, based on the actual alert system and how that works. So something that would cut that down, and there would be a number of things that would need to be done, but one would be, for example, minimizing, or sorry, setting a minimum amount of time for door logic, which would be when the rear door is used in order to indicate that there's someone in the back, that it's actually a minimum amount of time in order for it to be activated. So if you just throw a bag in the back really quickly, that it wouldn't be constantly going off for you. And then you start to habituate yourself to that alert. And when it really is in need, perhaps you wouldn't be noticing it anymore. We suggest that there should be detection capabilities for all those gained access scenarios, having them always on, regardless of the door lock status, for example, because when we say that children couldn't get out of the car, that does not necessarily mean that the vehicle was locked. It could also be that the doors are very heavy or anything like that. So the locking of the vehicle with a child inside, we don't feel should be of a reason for an alert to be given or not to be given. And another one is that there should be actual occupant detection. This is once again to try and cut back on any kind of nuisance alerts that then all of a sudden alerts will start getting dismissed when it really is an urgent need for someone to pay attention to the situation, that there is a child in the back or a dog in the back or anything of that nature. And finally, that there are levels of alerts given to make sure that someone is paying attention to the situation, that someone has reacted to the situation. So therefore, not just going to a driver or parent or a caregiver, because if that person is ignoring or doesn't have their cell phone on them or something, however, it's going to get the attention of that individual, that then something goes to perhaps a bystander or emergency personnel or emergency contacts that that individual has stated would be able to address the situation. Just to know that someone is contacted to address it and that it's not just a forgotten alert somewhere. So that is my very high overview. You can go to the next one. We were funded by the National Surface Transportation Safety Center for Excellence. So I do want to thank them for that funding and also for you all for letting us speak and also hearing us out. That paper that I just talked about is up free for download. There is a link down at the bottom. Perhaps that can be sent in the chat box as well. And it will go way more in depth than I did just now. And also all of our email contact information, should you have any questions about any of this.
Thank you, Laurel. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you adjusting. Yes, I will absolutely send out an email to everybody that registered and participated today. I can include your article, the article from Dr. Williams, and I will include a link to cpsboard.org/heatstroke, where there is a list of resources and articles by Dr. David Diamond. And that is an outcome of the collaborative work group that is being led by NHTSA. So I want to thank everybody for their time today. We will schedule another meeting where we'll dive deeper into the work Laurel and team are doing. And we'll also get to hear about a project that Toxel is working on. If you have suggestions for collaboration and partnerships and new engagements, please feel free to reach out to me, email that to me, and we'll get that incorporated into the group. And if you have research that you'd like to share with this group, please also let me know that and we can get you on a future agenda. And with that, I just want to thank everybody again for your time and participation. And I look forward to working collaboratively so that we can get this issue down to zero. Thank you very much.